Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective. And today is Philosophy Friday. And we're going to be talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most interesting people that I've read. I've been about 100 pages into Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I know some of you probably have questions about Nietzsche's posthumous relationship with Ayn Rand, his influences on her. I think we're going to try to actually dedicate a separate episode to Nietzsche and Ayn Rand. So today it's just Nietzsche. And let's just say, based on previous Philosophy Friday episodes, I don't expect many awkward silences. Real quick announcement: the April 4th event with me and, quote, Carl Benjamin, or Sargon of Akkad, as he's called in the streets, is now on sale. Tickets now on sale. Link below, link in the chat. Go ahead, get your tickets, and it's free entry for members. So if you're thinking of becoming an Ayn Rand Center UK member, what better time than now? Everyone else who's not planning to be in London, that's the problem. Start thinking about how to get to London by April 4th. And of course, March 28th, that whole week, there's all types of free events and awesome events. So yeah, see you there. See you in London. Okay, enough with the announcements. Let's talk about Nietzsche with a guy who, I don't know, is he the Nietzsche of this episode? He's certainly up there. It's Jason Rheins.
Hi, how are you?
Good. So I didn't put much thought into that, labeling you as the Nietzsche. I guess you are highly advanced and poetic and all that. So what should I make of this?
Syphilitic.
What was that?
Less syphilitic.
Okay, well, that's good. But so what should I make of this book? I know it reads like a poem. And are Nietzsche's other books written more like explicit, like here's what I, Nietzsche, believe, or are they all written as like an artist?
No, well, almost none of them are written like, here is a treatise where I will argue these distinct points and like I will then show this and that. Most of his writings are written in short sections, sometimes even just maxims, sentences or two. Often organized around a kind of theme, but sometimes with kind of through lines of argument that you can see he's building up to a kind of point, or he's circling around the same idea or concept. They're almost all much more direct than Zarathustra, which is a kind of is it an allegory? Is it a kind of series of myths written in a quasi biblical or Vedic kind of style? Like, yeah. So I think Zarathustra is the hardest Nietzsche bit. I mean, except the stuff from maybe towards the end of his life where he might have been losing his mind. Well, he was losing his mind. He might have been losing his mind when he was writing some of this stuff, and then it got edited really badly. But other than that, Zarathustra is like the hardest thing to understand, and sometimes you're like, what does this symbolize? What is this about? What's the meaning of this phrase or passage? It's harder than his other stuff, which is not to say the other stuff isn't difficult in a couple of respects, which I'll name in a moment. The other stuff is difficult. It's just Zarathustra is a lot more difficult, and you can get much less agreement, I think, over its interpretation than some of the other works, which is not to say they're all agreed upon, but at least we're more in the ballpark of knowing what he's getting at. He's not kind of hiding or playing around with us quite as much. The challenges to the other bits are that, like I said, they're not, to think the challenges with them as philosophy is that they're written in a style that most philosophers in the 19th century and certainly the 20th and 21st century don't write in. And they're not really sort of written in a way that makes it easy to kind of get a kind of systematic picture out of him. It's not clear that he would want them to anyway. That he wants you to read him like there's a system and that it's all going to be consistent with itself and so on. So yeah, Zarathustra is the hardest thing to start with. It's also in some ways the most popular because it's so evocative and beautiful in certain parts and mysterious. But I would say that something like Beyond Good and Evil, or Human to Human, or The Gay Science, or the Genealogy of Morals is more accessible to getting some of his basic thought.
Okay, I have to ask, what does he mean by the gay science?
So Gaia Scientia is a phrase in Provençal, so Southern French dialect. And it was the phrase used by the troubadours to refer to their art, the gay or happy, like science. And then that gets translated into German, which then gets translated to our the gay science. And so basically it means poetry. And in fact, the gay science, that book, has many of his own original poems, which are very good, as well as his philosophical reflections. And the gay science is part of I think it's 1881. It's part of a kind of trend that you see in Human, All Too Human, and some of his other stuff from the late 1870s and early 1880s, where he's beginning to, where he's moved away from Wagner, moved away from like art and aesthetics is everything, increasingly is reading natural science stuff and is getting interested in it. Doesn't actually mean he understands it very well. He's an excellent philologist, not his understanding of natural science, not very good, but is at least impressed by it, and impressed by what certain historical methods, which philologists share, and biological methods and psychological messages would teach us about our morality itself and our philosophy or metaphysics itself. So it's both poetry, but it's also this kind of science of the use, the kind of application of sort of science upon the subjection of philosophy to science. And it's also in some ways in the gay science where he talks about an art, a kind of art of living as well, or becoming an artist of living, a kind of living a poetic life, the life of a poet or free spirit, but also the person who creates their own narrative for their life as a way of affirming it.
So there's so much to like about Nietzsche, and it's so clear that he loves art. I mean, it's clear to me reading. So I guess if we could talk about Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is the one I'm reading, how I'm sort of interpreting it's Nietzsche's the character Zarathustra is Persian, which maybe signifies kind of like a pre-Greek, or a non-Greek sort of non-scientific, non-philosophical, non-Western existence, and Nietzsche is decrying the complacence of the industrial world and saying it was more noble to live on the countryside as herdsmen and tribal people. Your face says no, so go ahead.
I don't think I've never interpreted it as anti-industrial in that way. I don't think Nietzsche has any kind of preciousness about nature the way early 19th century, late 18th century, even like romantics do. I think Nietzsche thinks, all the biology and stuff shows us, and Nietzsche's own sort of sense of nature is like it's brutal and it's deadly and so on. And Nietzsche likes culture as an idea, as a kind of construct that humans make to kind of stretch and strain ourselves in various ways. I think it's more that Zarathustra, so it's more that he's criticizing, I think, European culture, especially German culture in his day, and sees it as morally complacent, as in certain respects intellectually bankrupt, as inheriting a kind of moral system that's kind of a carcass, and Zarathustra is Zarathustra, you might think of the figure of Zarathustra as the kind of what John the Baptist is to Jesus, Zarathustra is to the overman, to the man who will overcome man, who and which in some sense is like maybe the future of our species, but in another sense is just a man who has a new kind of morality or way of life that goes beyond the false dichotomies and errors of current morality in his society. And so Zarathustra is sort of like saying, I'm not this yet, but I am the bridge to that. And you might think of Nietzsche himself, or Nietzsche's understanding of his own kind of work in moral philosophy, as that, namely, like, this is not the code of the Overman. This is the foretelling of the coming of the Overman. Like, this is not the new morality that will go beyond good and evil. This is saying that we need a morality that will go beyond the good evil dichotomy.
Yeah,
at least that's how I take it. But I mean, like, I always feel like I'm on shaky ground when it comes to Zarathustra. Let me just say, so Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, is another way of rendering the name in the West. Ziusudra was a ancient Persian religious leader and philosopher, semi mythical. It's not I don't know if scholars have a firm position on whether there was such a person or not. I think they tend to think probably there might have been somebody, but then the dating is very difficult, because in ancient times people thought he lived thousands and thousands of years before the Greeks, and now we think, if there was a person, maybe he lived 700, 600 BCE. In any case, there emerges a philosophy associated with his name, a religious philosophy of Zoroastrianism, and it is associated with a kind of a dualistic theism, where you have a kind of force of goodness in the universe, Ahura Mazda, and you have an evil kind of source, Ahriman, the evil spirit, and Ahrimanyu, and one, through good deeds and good thoughts and good words, one kind of assumes the role of being on the side of light as against darkness in the universe. And so, I mean, and so it's fairly philosophically, even in the Gathas, it seems like it has a fairly sophisticated philosophy on certain areas quite early on, and earlier in some cases than the Greeks. So, and probably influenced the Greeks in certain very unclear ways. And Nietzsche, as a philologist, is aware that some of this influence had happened. I don't know to what extent that's supposed to be a kind of sub-theme of the book, that we're supposed to really think of this as Zarathustra historically, and then wonder about his philosophical influence. I tend to think that Zarathustra is a character he selects. He's of historical or semi-historical kind of interest to Nietzsche already, and he chooses to make him his kind of prophet of a new kind of way of being in the world. But I don't think it's specifically supposed to. I don't know if it's supposed to tie into what was known or what was speculated about the historical Zarathustra at the time. I suspect it's not really about that.
Yeah. Okay. So he's not. So I know I'm still early on in the book. So maybe Nietzsche is not necessarily telling people to disband, or he's not necessarily telling Supermen, like the admirable people, to leave civilization and go live back, to go back to the countryside, but rather we need a morality that's better than what we see around us. So what he sees, at least according to what I've read so far, is people living toward sleep, living toward death, kind of just, he's so beautiful. One of the things he says is, like, people need to answer 10 questions every day so they can sleep that night. And they need to have a certain number of meals so they can sleep that night. And when it comes to sex, like, I know I'm jumping around a bit, but Nietzsche, he says at one point that I've read, like don't even resist it if you're tempted by it. Like, but you shouldn't even be tempted by it. Like, you should be like a real Superman, like a real cool guy or whatever, is like not even tempted by something as pathetic as sex. Is that kind of am I reading?
I think that's, I mean, there's always an element, or there's often an element of kind of playful defiance, kind of stoking that Nietzsche does. So on the one hand, it's mocking the kind of monastic tendencies of Christians about sex. But then it's like, and I can do you one better. Like you talk about so much like, oh, it's so great to resist temptation. Like you haven't even asked what it would be to be beyond temptation. Like you weaklings. So I like, but then I think, I think, but I also think, I don't think his kind of ideal is an ascetic who's like, or who doesn't have any of this. It would just be like, he would be beyond thinking of it as temptation anyway, right? It would either be just something he wants to do and he does it, or he doesn't and he doesn't, right? Like, but to be in this weird precarious situation of wanting to do something you don't want to do, or wanting what you don't want, that kind of thing, that's in some way the kind of the inferior position to be overcome. And again, like there are nuances here. So like, is Zarathustra saying like, is he telling people to do this or to turn to this, or is he just foretelling it, right? Like, is Nietzsche trying to convince anybody, or is he just saying this is what's coming, this is where you are, and like I'm just like I can just see you're asleep and you're sheep, and I'm gonna say it, but like I don't,
Yeah. So it's so there's a lot of mystery. There's a lot of kind of humor, or just poetry in what he says. So do we actually know? Is there actually consensus? Like, what is the philosophy of Nietzsche? Like, does he have metaphysics? Did he work out his ethics? Like, I mean, if it's taken you this long to answer, perhaps no.
There are two poles of interpretation, and there is a spectrum between them. And one kind of hermeneutic pole, interpretive pole, is to think of Nietzsche as more systematic and more coherent, and to represent him as more of a kind of philosopher of a familiar bent, with a different style of presentation, perhaps, but with arguments, with a system, with a metaphysics and epistemology and an ethics. And the other extreme, you have people who say, no, he's anti-system, he's anti-metaphysics, he's kind of even maybe anti-epistemology. Like he is tearing these things up. He thinks like that's the problem, is having this. And if you say, oh, he doesn't have a systematic metaphysics, you'd be like, yeah, because he thinks systems of metaphysics are like primitive mythologies. And like, why would he say, I have a primitive mythology to tell you? Why would he do that, right? So, or you just take him in this radically proto-deconstructionist way of like down with all systems. I think of myself as kind of somewhere in the middle, meaning I think that there are across the writings themes that recur and kind of tendencies he has that get emphasized again and again to enough of an extent that I feel comfortable saying, like, I think he inclines this way in general. But at the same time, I have to step back and say, but it's not always like that, and he's perfectly happy to say something against that. And if you pointed out that those seem contradictory, he might get a kick out of that. And then there's one further foil to this, which is that to the extent that there is a kind of systematic metaphysics and epistemology, it may be one which is self-undermining. That is to say, yeah, there may be a metaphysics and epistemology, and it's internally incoherent in the way that relativistic or certain kinds of subjective or even skeptical systems are sometimes self-contradictory. People refer to Nietzsche's epistemology as perspectivalist, which is a kind of sterilized way of saying maybe relativist or kind of relativist or relativist, but not like, maybe not exactly relativist. So the idea is like, don't just assume this is just relativism. Okay, it's perspectivalism. Okay, and then if you go, what's the difference? Now at the end of it, you might be like, okay, there's not much difference. It's the same thing. But the way that Nietzsche kind of expresses it and brings it out, there are times where it seems like there must be some kind of perspective from which he's making certain critiques. And like, there must be some Archimedean point he's standing on to say X, Y, Z. So for example, he'll say things that like our metaphysical systems come out of our psychological quirks, come out of our historical circumstance, come out even out of like the poor place we are in the evolution of our species. Like our whole like we will evolve beyond our current metaphysics, which is just a product of this kind of primitive way of looking at things. And then you go, okay, where are you standing when you say that? Not, I presume, the more primitive position, or you know, he'll have a certain perspective where we tell stories about everything we say is an interpretation. Everything we say is a story that we layer on top this incoherent, chaotic, horrible reality. Okay, where are you standing when you say that? And it's not clear if you would just go, oh no, I'm in the mix too, or if there's some kind of standpoint from which you can say that. And so there are a lot of scholars who don't want to say that Nietzsche is incoherent in this way, but I've always, and I will grant you that he talks in many places like he's not inconsistent in this way, but then that's true about a lot of people who have this meta inconsistency, who have a self-exclusion fallacy. What's funny about Nietzsche is, on the one hand, he talks more like there's a place where he can stand, but on the other hand, he's also sort of more self-aware and more, I think, ready to laugh at himself, just sort of as in his character and his style of doing it. So it's hard to know exactly how to negotiate things. At the end of the day, my personal sense, and I'm not a Nietzsche expert, and I don't know the depths of the kind of how to interpret Nietzsche and perspectivalism debates, but my sense is at the end of the day, you can't make it coherent. Like it's at certain level, if it's true, it can't be true. And if this is his story, he doesn't have a story, right? Like, I think that's probably where it ends up, but you can step back and be like, there seems to be a repeating kind of meta story about things. It would apply to itself and undermine itself, but here's what it would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's like a real comedian. I don't know if he's like the first of his kind of writer, but like to me, he kind of reminds me of like old, like Lenny Bruce tapes. I don't know if you've listened to those. A lot of it's gibberish. A lot of it's inaccessible, but like, then periodically he'll blurt out something like completely like accessible, understandable, and just hilarious. I think one of the things that really resonates with me reading Nietzsche is just how important emotions are to him. Kind of like now this is disastrous without like a rational guide, but on a personal level, it's like, yes, emotions and values are just such, obviously it's everything, it's life. So so the fact that he takes emotion so seriously resonates. And then my question is also like, is that his epistemology basically? Is he an emotionalist saying so? But maybe that ties back to the whole relativist versus perspectivalist that you were talking about.
I don't think, like he doesn't sort of have the view like your feelings are sort of true. If anything, or at least in some works like Human to Human, and he's or Younger, he's looking at certain past systems of philosophy and saying what you thought of as this metaphysical distinction is kind of like your interpretation of your feelings. And there he kind of thinks like, no, science will actually kind of give us a truer picture of all of this. Science will even give us a history of philosophy, in the sense that we will come to see the history of philosophy as a series of errors based on our psychologies, our biologies, our misinterpretations of these various signals that we have, all of which will like make some historical and biological and psychological sense. And there's Nietzsche can be sort of scathing about philosophers, moralists who just sort of take their feelings, or including feelings of like guilt and shame, and like inflate them into systems that have no validity. And he can at the same time say things like, you know, these various systems try to stifle passions and try to stifle even irrationality in a way that he thinks is a kind of false dichotomy. So even some of the ways we kind of say the rational and the irrational we'll have to overcome and are primitive. And there's a sense in which civilized man, European man, as he sees it, has been sort of self-neutered by Christian and Christian infused philosophy. And there's a way in which what will surpass it will be more disciplined and, in a sense, better bred, literally, than like kind of early human barbarism that was much more sort of like animals. But on the other hand, it will also be in some ways, you might think, more animalistic, in that it will release certain passions, energies that Christianity has kind of stifled and bound and kind of tried to kill or sublimated it in an unhealthy way or something. Not sublimated, suppressed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, why don't we jump to super chats, because some of this might actually be the questions I would have asked. All right. Jonathan Honig sent 199 3 times in a row. Jonathan, keep hitting that button. I don't think it's working. Thank you, Jonathan. Enric with 499 says, what is Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism and work to resolve it?
Depending on who you ask, Nietzsche is a nihilist, or he thinks other kinds of philosophies, in some ways like Christianity, is in a certain sense nihilistic, in the sense that it wants you to kind of worship death and nothingness, and there's nothing beyond this life, there's no afterlife, and so you're just devoting yourself to nothing, to not being. I think Nietzsche thinks, here's one way of looking at some of Nietzsche about this. Ultimate reality, the noumenal, if you will, though he thinks those categories are kind of mistaken. Ultimate reality is this kind of chaotic, incoherent like thing, and it's terrifying, and there's no meaning in it, and we have to look at that and accept that, and then laugh, and then go on living. And how? Well, like, go on living about what? About like the truth that you tell me the truth is meaningless. The truth is empty. It's chaos. Yeah, make a story. Right, you're right. Reality has like, if you tear back all the veils, there's just this howling void. So make a new veil for yourself, but do it self-consciously. Know it's a veil. And embrace that too, and say, yes, like, this is the lie I'm living.
Mm-hmm.
And you go, but it's a lie. You're like, yes, but it's my lie, and I know it, and I choose it, and I accept it, and it's good. That's one kind of way of thinking about how Nietzsche faces it. And now someone goes, so it's all lies for him. So isn't he a nihilist? Like, yes, but on the other hand, he's saying, but we're not gonna become pessimists about it. We're not gonna give up because of it. Real strength is being able to like embrace moving on from it and accept that.
Is he an existentialist? Is that his officially his school, or is the answer complicated there as well? Do people disagree?
Complicated. He's often ranked among important existentialist philosophers. Here's how it is and isn't. In terms of existentialism, I mean, part of it is he's saying the world lacks the kind of rigid meaning traditionally given to it by Christian or Judeo-Christian monotheism with a God and absolute truth and a future of the soul and traditional morality. So that mixed package of both theological nonsense and also certain notions of objectivity, like that's out. We have to create something to move beyond it. We're creating it. Like it's not just there in the world to be discovered. All of that sounds very existentialist. The part that isn't is that often in existentialism, what's emphasized is the kind of choice, the power of free will, that we don't have a human nature, that that we decide what we are. Now, Nietzsche does think we have human nature. He thinks it evolves over time, and Nietzsche does not endorse free will. He thinks that's a mistake. And so he's not an existentialist in that way. And yet, in the idea of kind of becoming an artist of living, in the idea of kind of creating your own new values, creating your own new kind of code or your own new meaning, it sounds sort of voluntarist. It sounds like I'm just willing this to be, and it's up to me. And so that's that part again. I mean, but like as with radical skepticism or radical relativism, you can't fully endorse it without kind of contradicting yourself. Nobody, even determinists, ever totally talks like a determinist all the time. And so, some of that comes across. So that's the sense in which I think he's existentialist, and I think he's not. But what is an existentialist is like, it's a super, I think, tricky question.
Okay. Michael then asks a question which may warrant an entire episode. He says, what is the relationship between Kant and Nietzsche, and why did the Nazis like him so much?
So, okay. So Nietzsche fairly despises Kant. He thinks that Kant's whole kind of metaphysical apparatus is sort of built up around a thinly disguised kind of Christian kind of ethics, and some of its most stolid and rule bound and kind of worst. So Nietzsche tends to have very, very, very critical things to say about Kant. But Nietzsche is influenced by Schopenhauer, who sees himself as a neo-Kantian, a kind of Kantian. And Nietzsche tends to kind of look askance the various post-Hegelian and post-Kantians or the neo-Kantians in his sort of intellectual circles and their various metaphysical posturings, but he's also in some ways in their wake, including in some of the ways of thinking that we're isolated from things in themselves, even if he finds the distinction between things in themselves and appearances itself perhaps confused. Why do the Nazis? Okay, so Nietzsche dies in 1900, but in 1889, at the age of 45, he suffered a complete mental breakdown. His health had been very bad for 20 years or so. And he's in an asylum. And we believe it's probably the results of neurodegeneration, having contracted syphilis. At least that's the standard story I've always heard. During that time, first he's under his care of his mother, who then dies, and then under the care of his sister, who he hated, and his sister's husband, who he super hated, who was the leading anti-Semite in Germany at the time. And his sister and this other guy, contrived basically to kind of interpret in particular the stuff that Nietzsche was scribbling, while he was in an insane asylum, and putting it together in various ways that made it more appealing and cast it in more of this anti-Semitic light. And that then became appealing to the Nazis. Now, I'm fairly certain Nietzsche would have despised the Nazis, But there are some things in Nietzsche. Nietzsche called himself an anti-Semite. He hated his sister and her husband. He thought they were imbeciles. He describes at certain times a kind of admiration for European Jews for their ability to survive and adapt in such a harsh environment, social environment as they had in Christian Europe. But there is another sense in which he has something really negative to say about Judaism and is anti-Semitic. And that is, Judaism is bad because it caused Christianity. So like the Jews, so it's not so much the Jews are responsible for killing Christ, it's the Jews are responsible for creating Christ. And that's much worse. And he thinks of a kind of, he has a very negative sort of description of the priestly morality of early Judaism. But then he thinks that Christianity arose out of it and became something much worse. So there's nothing that he can say about sort of Judaism that he doesn't have much worse things to say typically about Christianity, at least as it develops or as it finds itself in St. Paul and thereon. St. Paul himself started out as a Jew. So there are things. And then, of course, the other thing that the Nazis like is that in things like the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche talks about, he doesn't just talk about the kind of history of ideas, like this moral theory evolved in this way, but he also thinks of it as kind of affecting our breeding, like it getting, like these codes of values getting kind of into our DNA. So he believes there's such a thing as evolution, but he doesn't understand or doesn't agree with the Darwinian conception. It's something much closer to a Lamarckian kind of view where there are these acquired traits that come along and that get inherited. And so it seems like he's talking about different kinds of races carrying different kinds of codes of values. And people kind of, then there's another problem, which is that when Nietzsche talks about Aryans, he means specifically the Proto-Indo-European people who went into northern India and established like the caste system and the Vedic pantheon and everything. He does not mean like northern Europeans, but that got confused with a bunch of pseudoscientific race theories that were popular at the time. And so some of what Nietzsche has to say about the kind of slave morality and about the overman who will come, the Ubermensch coming, or about the kind of the downtrodden, the Chandala, gets kind of reappropriated in Nazi and proto-Nazi kind of race theory, as the Jews are this resentful under race, underclass, who resent their superiors and try to kill it from within with certain values, including certain Christian values. There's a strain of Nazism that says, we're defending Christianity from communism. But there's also a strain of Nazism that is like, Christianity is Jewish, and we are going to return to our pagan Germanic roots with Wotan. And, like the Nazis were working on like, what would Nazi theology be? And they couldn't figure out like, is Hitler the second coming of Jesus, or is he like Thor or whatever, like not Thor, but some kind of Nordic thing. They couldn't figure out where they wanted to go with it. So that's how they pick up on things in Nietzsche and they go, oh, okay, yeah, nice. And they spin it in a certain way, which is not how Nietzsche sees it exactly. But you can see how someone could read what Nietzsche is saying and think like, oh, okay, it's like this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you mix rationality with its opposite, however I'm trying to paraphrase Ayn Rand, and her analogy of poison with food. And, as you're talking about this interpretation of evolution, I'm thinking to myself, well, good thing everyone today who invokes evolution knows exactly what the hell they're saying, right? No, I mean, but this brings up maybe another reason that the Nazis were enamored by Nietzsche, and I think I see it today with the alt-right and these freaks that are popping up, which is Nietzsche kind of presents this strong figure that's not concerned so much with like thinking things out, but just rushes out and takes what he wants or does what he wants. So is that kind of something that would inspire?
Yeah, the idea of this kind of blonde brute appealed to Nazis then and Nazis now. um, and that was a kind of thing that they grabbed onto, right? Like there's the Nietzsche admires certain things about the master morality or the good bad morality of pre-Christian, the kind of morality of Romans, but you might think it's the morality of Viking chieftains, where I'm strong, I'm tough, I'm going to take what I want, and I can because I can, and you can't stop me because you can't, and that makes me good and you bad because I'm stronger than you, and it's good to be strong, and it's bad to be weak. And you might then go, that makes sense. And there's something also very unpretentious about it, and like very honest and direct about it. And I think Nietzsche thinks that's the case, that you might think there's an inherent kind of dishonesty in the motivation and the kind of hard wiring of the slave morality, where at a certain level, slaves know it's not good to be slaves, but they're so resentful about it, they want to convince the masters that it's bad to be strong. And so there's a kind of bad faith kind of baked in.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, if you had something, I know we got just a couple minutes.
I don't have that much time. Yeah. Are there more super chats?
There are, but you probably can hang up if you want when you need to leave, and I can read the rest because, well,
let's hear them. I've got
Okay. Rat Lover asks, what is theism? That's the belief in God. Glad I can help. Robert says, what's Irish and spends the night outside your door? Hopefully not gingers. I don't really know what that quest is. Is that a joke? Okay. Thank you. Allison says, great episode. Thank you. All right. Bradley with €5 says, okay. All right. With 2 minutes left. Could the Superman be biologically correct in that high intelligence combined with some gifted neurology, such as Asperger's, makes for creative giants?
So I think all right. So first thing, like the idea of an Ubermensch as something that's actually going to like be evolutionarily beyond the human species, like that occurs on geological timescales or on evolutionary timescales, which are not the timescales of human culture and ideas. And Nietzsche, I think, is just kind of doesn't know that clearly. So somebody can come up with a morality that moves beyond, say, altruism, and they are just human. And they might even be, a super intelligent human being, and their kids will probably be normal, intelligent human beings, like not necessarily something like that. Asperger's, people with Asperger's, people with certain other, who are neuroatypical, can sometimes excel in certain areas, but at the same time, they also have certain very significant deficits. And some of those can be overcome, or sometimes you can channel it or you can harm, but it's not, I don't think we should pretend that that neuroatypicalities are superpowers. They're not like they're not necessarily super weaknesses, or they can have certain advantages to them for sure. But I should also say that let me leave that aside. So I mean, I don't think Nietzsche thinks that. I mean, I don't think Nietzsche is aware of like something like an autism spectrum disorder, or even that paired with high intelligence and what we used to call Asperger's. So I think he literally thinks somebody who's gone beyond these current moral, the system of good evil, that is the Christian ethical system of self-sacrifice. So yeah, I mean, but look, eventually, will something biologically evolve from our species? Yeah, I mean, yeah. 1,000,000 years from now, will our descendants, if there are any around, will our descendants be exactly as we are now? No, there'll probably be some differences. There may even be, we might even speciate into two lineages, or probably in 1,000,000 years, we'd still all be able to reproduce together, but it's possible. Not. So yeah, we'll evolve, like we're evolving. Evolution doesn't stop, but it's very slow. And people with unusual traits don't necessarily, that doesn't mean you have speciation yet, you know?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much when we discuss evolution and humans are involved that have free will and philosophy and planning long term and all that. There's so much that needs to be unpacked. Okay, Bradley, we don't have time for your question.
What was the question? Just
Brett, question is there a difference between productive ambition and will to power? One of context in capitalist environment, the desire for greatness is productive.
I mean, I think there is a difference in the will to power and productive ambition in Rand. That's a good question for kind of a Rand and Nietzsche comparison.
Yeah, so that's hopefully next time we can link up. Thank you everybody for joining us. Coming up today at 7 p.m. UK time, it's Finance Friday with Jim Brown. He's going to be talking about the pandemic QE and its aftermath. Then at 8 p.m. UK time, James Valiant is discussing Leonard Peikoff's essay, Assault from the Ivory Tower, with Robert and Amy Nasser. Thank you, Rat Lover, for the super chats, and everyone else. Remember, Sargon and I's event, April 4th. Tickets on sale now. Thank you, Jason. And I won't be here next week because I will be traveling. But see you all in London if we don't talk sooner. And see you, Jason, when I'm back in the greatest country on God's earth. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.